Now we are embarking upon a new subtopic here, and that's referred to as paradigm shifts upon contact. And contact here, of course, refers to 1492, right? And perhaps the years and maybe the few decades afterward, right? This period where both peoples from both sides of the world are encountering each other for the first time. They know nothing about each other. And as I remarked earlier, it's a confrontation that's marked by tension and uncertainty and often conflict. So we just left behind our brief discussion, very brief actually, that was about pre-contact civilizations on both sides of the world. The New World, for example, was marked by incredible diversity when we're talking about New World inhabitants, diversity in terms of linguistic differentiation, physical features, social organization, and so on and so forth. And why did we discuss this, by the way? Because we wanted to underline and emphasize the idea that these native inhabitants were just as diverse as those human populations in the old world. Okay, stated otherwise, they did not belong to the singular quote racial category, right? And certainly, inhabitants of the New World didn't see themselves as belonging to the one race, right? But of course, let's remind us that practically all Europeans, upon quote stumbling upon the New World and then making attempts to colonize it and ultimately trying to subordinate Indians, and we'll discuss that very soon, they tended to think of New World inhabitants as one single race. Okay. And by the way, this brings up this important notion, which perhaps I'm introducing very early right now, but I'll introduce it nonetheless. It's this idea that race is a social construction. That is to say, it's not biological. Skin colors and its differentiation among people, right, determined by skin color, is something that human beings create and invent, right? No such thing as natural racial distinction, like when we talk about, for example, Indian blood, or European blood, or Spanish blood, or Chinese blood, right? No such thing as a biological component to race. Okay, I'm going to harken back to that concept quite often, in fact, in a few slides to come. But I just thought I'd introduce it now. But let's also recall our last discussion we just left behind about Europe leaving behind this sort of dark cave of, the medieval era marked by lack of intellectual production, intellectual ferment, everything being suffused with a sense of religion, religiosity, and supernatural beliefs, superstition, right? And during this early modern period, again, let's remind us this is the period of, let's say, the 1450s onward till about the 1800s. Early modern Europe was beginning to advance ideas like early science, early capitalism, and thinking about the world in secular terms, especially, in terms of cause and effect, right? What caused the earthquake? Well, is it that God is angry at the world, or is it, tectonic shifts, right, in the earth? Well, most people believe the first explanation back then. But we see here the beginning of scientific thinking, as advanced by Isaac Newton and Galileo and those famous figures. Okay, so yeah, Europe, despite being backwards and behind, especially compared to the advanced civilizations. And let me go back to this old world map here. Okay, and it's just sort of a recap, but we remarked upon the fact that Asia, India, and Ming Dynasty China, especially, were the wealthiest regions of the old world. This entire map is how you saw the world if you were a New World resident. And this is the reason why you had these Europeans, which, by the way, is grossly exaggerated in this map. It's much smaller in proportion to this area, right? But nonetheless, these Europeans are trying to reach Asia in search of wealth. And Portugal, by the way, which is located here, right? Due to their close proximity to Africa, they were theorizing that they could go around the continent, though they did not know for certain that there was a tip at the very southernmost point of the African continent that they could go around. But they did hear reports from local Africans saying, yes, in fact, you know, you can get around the African continent if you sail for weeks or however long it took. And the Portuguese, therefore, decided to venture southward. By the 1460s, they had established interesting plantations here to grow sugar off these islands, not in the actual continent, but islands off Africa, like the Azores and the Canary Islands. And here they began to experiment with something called plantation agriculture. And this is important because that experiment in plantation agriculture, using local or African slaves to labor on the fields, and sometimes they're only planting one or two crops, right, rather than a variety of crops. This is something new in capitalism because, or new due to capitalism, I should say, because you could sell in the market, right? Whereby in pre-capitalist systems, if you were agriculturalists, well, you had to farm more than one thing because you eat more than one thing, right? But this idea of selling on the market, right, as we're all familiar with now, is something that was starting here in the early modern period. Okay, so they had established this plantation systems which would traverse itself to the Caribbean and even Virginia in the tobacco fields eventually. But by 1488, they reach the bottommost area or the southernmost area of the African continent. And then by 1498, they reached India. Okay, so, you know, you could have easily, well, let's just ask the question again. Why didn't the Portuguese discover the America? Well, idea is pretty self-evident. They weren't interested in taking the route that Columbus, who was actually an Italian or Genoese, sponsored by the Spanish crown here, they chose to go that way, right? That fortuitous decision to explore going west on the Atlantic. Okay, so this will change human history forever. We now have contact between different continents, which for the most part were isolated from each other practically from the beginning of human history. So if we conceptualize it in these terms, this is indeed one of the most important events in world history. It's the reason why we still sort of observe it as Columbus Day today. But so we're talking about contact now, right? And here, paradigm shifts is a term I'm sort of appropriating from this. He's a historian of science. His name is Thomas Kuhn. And you don't have to know him, but definitely be aware of what we mean by paradigm shifts. Okay, a paradigm shift is when there's a drastic change in worldview. Okay, not necessarily of an individual worldview, but you know, of people en masse, right? And when that happens, it's called a paradigm shift. Okay, let me give you an example, which actually happened just a few decades before Columbus, in the 15th century, and that was a paradigm shift that occurred following a theory put forth by Copernicus. You may be familiar with Copernicus. He was an astronomer, and he advanced the notion that it was not the case that the sun revolves around the earth. Actually, the opposite is true. The earth revolves around the sun. This is called the Copernican revolution. Okay, now, if let's say you were a peasant back in Europe this time, and you heard this theory, you thought it was absolute rubbish, right? After all, every day you wake up, you don't feel the earth moving, but you see the sun move every day, right, from east to west. How could this be, right? So from the sort of common sense perspective, it was ridiculous. And certainly Copernicus, or Copernican theory was greeted with controversy at first, but eventually it was accepted. And I would say 99.9% of us today believe in Copernican revolution. So what we had happen is a paradigm shift in the way we saw the world, right? That's a paradigm shift. So what I'm arguing here is just as Copernican revolution affected a shift in the worldview that changed the way they saw the world forever, so did contact. And it could be basically summed up in these three ideas here. Okay, so that is geographic revolution, creation of the Atlantic Ocean, and Columbian exchange. They're all interrelated. They're all intermeshed, if you will, as a shift in the worldview. Okay, so the first one is geographic revolution. It's quite simple. Okay, this is the notion that the entire world, as it was known to Europe, the old world, more than doubled in size, geographically speaking, once it was established that indeed there was this new world on the other side of the Atlantic. Okay, so geographically, that's astounding. You wake up one day and you realize, wow, the world's so different. There's this new part of the world that is unknown, right? And it's yet to be, quote, discovered entirely, right? All right, so along with this, you have this idea of the creation of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I'm using quotes around creation, and that's because, of course, the Atlantic Ocean existed as this vast body of water that separated the old world from the new world, even in 1491 and way before that, right? Of course it did. It wasn't literally created with Columbus, but from the perspective of Europeans, it certainly was created. Okay, what do we mean by this? It means that this sort of ocean bridge that connected both worlds was finally established with the constant voyages going back and forth, right? You had this vast and elaborate network of trade and communication between both continents that are going to happen. It's going to develop and flourish eventually as history unfolds, right? So no longer was the Atlantic Ocean, from the European perspective, this vast body of undisturbed water, right? In fact, you probably know this. A lot of people did not know if there was an end to the Atlantic Ocean. Some people, actually a lot of people, believed the earth was flat. If you were not educated, or if you weren't a navigator, if you were a common day peasant, you believed the earth was flat. And most believed that if you kept sailing west, you'd just fall off the edge of the world. If you Google end of the world, right, edge of the world in medieval times, you could probably find some artistic renderings of it, right? This imagination of what was there meeting you at the end of the world as you fell off, right? Now that idea is no longer around, okay? No longer is this water undisturbed as it was for the longest time. Now is greatly, quote, disturbed by, again, this vast network interconnecting both sides of the world. And in a way, this is really the beginning of globalization, to use a term that you might be familiar with, right? This whole interconnection of the whole world. This is arguably one of the first processes involved in the larger event of human globalization, right? That is to say, creation of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so we also have, as a result of the Atlantic Ocean, this exchange happening between both worlds. And that's known appropriately as the Columbian Exchange. You have things, items being brought across. A lot of them were unfamiliar, did not exist in the side of the world where they were going to, right? For example, let's imagine Columbus now realizes, okay, I'm not in India, it's a new world, and I'm going to head back to Spain and bring, if you will, it's really kind of evidence, right? Evidence that I reached this new world, and I'm going to bring it back to King Philip and Queen Isabel, the Spanish benefactors, right? So what does he do? He might bring various animals, various plants. Certainly wants to bring some kind of wealth, gold, and he even brings people, right, natives, back to Spain. But eventually what gets brought back and forth after this very first exchange are more practical things, okay? Or things that are going to increase wealth, especially on the side of Europeans, right? So if we first think, however, of stuff being brought from the New World to the Old World, we could think of various foods, especially like corn or maize. So many others, right, that were brought that changed the diet of Europeans forever, right? And of course, they're bringing gold over to the New World and silver, and that's going to increase the coffers of the imperial treasury, right? So much so that's going to cause a crisis in Europe called the Price Revolution. So much gold is going to flow. Okay, so that's going from the New World, right? Food like corn, potatoes, even things like tobacco, right? Things that can't be ingested. Well, not ingested, it can't be eaten, but certainly taken in, and it's really a drug, right? That's going to change human history, right? Tobacco and smoking. But also, we have to say gold and riches brought to Spain. Now, what's being brought over in the Columbian Exchange from the Old World to the New World? Well, certainly we have technology, European technology, which I said was very advanced at this time. Iron technology, their sailing ships. You know, when the Indians first encountered the European ships, they didn't know what to make of them because they'd never seen sails on a ship before, right? They thought they were gods on the clouds, right? But you had these sailing ships, firearms, even, you know, the wheel itself, or a domesticated horse, right? And they also brought ideas across the Columbian Exchange. You could probably think of probably the most important idea brought across, and that's Christianity, right? Now, of course, you can't ignore what was probably the most devastating of the items brought across Columbian Exchange, and this is something that we could relate to today in our pandemic, and that is the transmission of deadly microorganisms towards which natives had no immunity, no immunological resistance towards. Right? So Europeans unknowingly, of course, brought these deadly microbes, and, you know, measles, influenza, smallpox. It's going to wreak untold damage. And I mentioned this earlier, to the point where over 90% the human population, the native population in the New World would perish within 1 century, wiped out. Okay, some people think it's as high as 95%. All right, so that's just an enormous loss of life. And let me remind you that upwards to 70 million people resided in the New World even before contact. All right. So this brings us to this important concept known as ecological imperialism. And by the way, this theory was advanced by the historian named Alfred Crosby, Crosby, and he relates it directly to the Columbian Exchange and this transmission of the deadly microbes and pathogens brought across the Columbian Exchange that wreaked havoc and ultimately a demographic disaster upon a new world. So Crosby is pondering the question of this idea of European exceptionalism. Remember that? It's the idea that Europe conquered the New World and ultimately controlled 90% of the world by, of course, 1900, due to the fact that their civilization was vastly superior than the rest of the world. This superiority led them to domination. It's just the natural course of things, if you will. But Crosby considers this fact that is it really a matter of European exceptionalism, or could there be reasons other than culture that explains, especially the English success. Now, what he points towards is what we just discussed: the ecological disaster wrought by these deadly germs, the epidemics and pandemics, so forth, right? And if we note that 95%, according to some estimates, were decimated as a population, then it seems that domination is almost inevitable. Okay, so what Crosby is saying is this. Let's note, Crosby says, that the Europeans had complete immunological resistance to New World diseases and pathogens. But when you look at the other way around, New World inhabitants had no immunological resistance from Old World diseases. So that encounter, the initial encounter, is obviously going to not be a, quote, fair exchange, right? It's not going to be an equal exchange. What's going to happen is, as this Columbian Exchange unfolds and the European pathogens inflict damage, New World people are going to die. They're going to die off, okay? So what he's saying is this, Crosby, that the success of European imperialism, domination that is, has a biological component. It's not purely cultural, that is to say, exceptionalism, superiority, right? Basically, Crosby's theory is that Europeans were successful in their imperialism because wherever they brought their persons, their agriculture, their animals, well, the animals they brought, they thrived in the New World, okay? The people thrived in the New World. They had resistance to New World diseases, right? Meanwhile, the indigenous population and really the local ecosystems collapsed under the biological advance of Europeans. So the best way to imagine this, perhaps, is not to think of European sort of explorers coming over, conquerors, with their cannons and ships and superior technology, military technology, and so forth, coming over, and due to their superior technology, and let alone their belief in Christianity, conquering the New World successfully, as was often told in the histories written by these persons who believed in European exceptionalism. Crosby says that's not the case. All right, success of conquest was due to ecological imperialism. What you have to imagine, in other words, is this, if you will, tidal wave of germs just coming over and wiping out, like a tsunami, wiping out the New World. That's what you have to imagine. Don't imagine actual people just, there with their superior know-how and cannon, and technology. No, just imagine, as I mentioned, this tidal wave wreaking havoc. Okay, so it's about biology, it's about ecology, not culture. So notice one thing about Crosby and ecological imperialism. Number one, I just noted this. He is questioning the idea of European exceptionalism. Okay, the idea that Europeans were bound to conquer the New World based on their inherent superiority. And number two, he's stating this, that it's a contingent fact that Europeans dominated the New World. Why? Hopefully you can think about this, right? Remember the distinction that I made between contingent truth and necessary truth, right? Contingent truth refers to, well, it's true, but it could have happened otherwise. Whereas necessary truth argues the opposite is true and it cannot be false, period. Okay, so what he's arguing here, it's a contingent fact that New World inhabitants had no resistance towards the Old World diseases. Okay? And therefore, this lodges this idea of not only European exceptionalism, but the idea that it had to happen necessarily, that it's inevitable due to, again, advanced civilization of Europe. Well, let me leave you with this. What if, this is sort of a thought experiment, what if it was the case that New World inhabitants had complete immunity to Old World microorganisms being brought across Columbian exchange? What if they had complete immunological resistance, but the Old World explorers coming across had zero resistance? What would happen? Will we see Columbus successfully settling, let alone other Europeans later? Imagine this small fleet of ships coming over, meeting the Indians or livestock or whatever, or animals, whatever, and they're just succumbing to disease, okay, because they have no resistance. In fact, we wouldn't be sitting here right now talking about the Columbian exchange, because European settlement would have never happened. This emphasizes the contingency behind European settlement after contact, right? So these are the two things you want to acknowledge about Crosby's theory of ecological imperialism. Number one, that it emphasizes ecology as the foremost component of imperialism. Number two, that European conquest was contingent, right? And he interrogates the idea of exceptionalism. So we'll move on to our next